Neil Katyal, I mean, I take from Bill Taylor's testimony today a real Republicans, if you're listening moment. Here's what he testified to today. This is Bill Taylor. I have dedicated my life to serving U.S. interests at home and abroad in both military and civilian roles. My background and experience are nonpartisan, and I've been honored to serve under every administration, Republican and Democratic, since 1985. For 50 years, I served the country, starting as a cadet at West Point, then as an infantry officer for 6 years, including with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam, then at the Department of Energy, then as a member of a Senate staff, then at NATO, then with the State Department here and abroad, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Jerusalem, and Ukraine. So Republicans today, Neil Katyal, have to decide if that man is lying when he says that aid, military aid for Ukraine, was tied to investigation into the Bidens.
Exactly, Nicolle. So I think we've heard from other folks in the past, prominent Republicans, warning alarms. What makes this different is two things. Number one, I've read that testimony, the 15-page statement. It is incredibly detailed and intricate. And number two, he has specifically access. He talks about a conversation, which I just put up on my Twitter, a conversation that he had with Ambassador Sondland, in which Sondland tells him directly, President Trump wants the aid conditioned from Ukraine on investigating the Bidens. And that's in what he said today. So, you can discount all sorts of other things that people say for all sorts of political reasons. He's got access to what actually happened, and he has detailed notes to prove it. So I think this is going to prove to be a very, very devastating day for President Trump.
Frank Figliuzzi, we spent 23 months trying to deduce what sort of evidence Robert Mueller had tying Donald Trump to the Russian conspiracy to impact the 2016 election. It would seem the effort to get Ukraine to impact the 2020 election, the evidence is now spilling out in a very, very public setting.
Nicolle, we've known for a long time that the greatest enemies of this president are the truth, the details, and the facts. And today, we've got plenty of truth, details, and facts. And for those people who might try to say that Ambassador Taylor's part of some deep state, you don't need to just read his bio. You need to understand that witness after witness are actually people who comprise the state. They aren't the deep state. They are the state. They are the embodiment of the values and principles of our government. And in fact, the president was trying to create the deep state. And one of the things that jumps out at me is the public nature of what the president was demanding, meaning what we're seeing in the testimony is that the Ukrainians had to come out publicly and say, we're going to investigate Burisma, we're investigating the Bidens. If you're really about anti-corruption, if that's what you're about, the president doesn't need that public declaration. He needs Ukraine to quietly go about their business getting rid of corruption. He was clearly looking for a public bashing of the Bidens.
And just to put a button on that, Frank, what Taylor testified to was that Sondland said President Trump wanted President Zelensky, quote, in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigations. Don't take my word for it, though. Let's bring in Democratic Congressman Andy Levin, who earlier in the day described today's testimony as, quote, very troubling, and said that this has been his most disturbing day in Congress so far. Take us through what was so disturbing to you that you heard today.
Hey, Nicolle. Well, I just want to emphasize how my patriotism sort of swells up when I meet one after another of these career foreign servants who it's so obvious, they don't care about Democrats, they don't care about Republicans. They are out there around the globe defending the national security of the United States. And to have the president himself say that he is going to put the muscle on a foreign leader to help him in his domestic political, problems, and then to have his acting chief of staff admit it before he walked it back on national TV. What was so disturbing today is just the weight of evidence is so overwhelming that it's a sad day for any patriot to have a president doing this. And anybody who cares about the national security of our country. And, Nicolle, let me say, I represent Warren, Michigan. I represent Sterling Heights, Michigan. We have a lot of Ukrainian Americans in my district who are patriotic Americans who love our country and love their homeland. And so the security of Ukraine, the budding democracy in Ukraine is a really important issue to me. And to see a president just put our vital interests like that at risk for his own political ends is something that we just can't stand for as Americans.
Congressman, is it as clear as what we've described that Ambassador Bill Taylor believes that military aid for American ally Ukraine, who is, as you just described, our buffer, our democratic ally there in Russia's neighborhood, that he testified today that military aid for that country was tied to a public commitment to investigate Burisma?
I apologize, Nicolle. I heard just now, while I was listening, that you all evidently have this testimony. I apologize. I'm not going to talk about what he said at all. I really respect this process. What I can tell you is that the case is overwhelming, and it really ratifies the process we're going through. Very soberly, having witness after witness come in and build the fact case about what actually transpired. And as other people have said, there were a tremendous number of well-documented facts that came out. And so it's just troubling the way this case is building. And what I'd say to the American people is that if they want a picture of it, here's the picture. You've got a very crowded room of Democrats and Republicans sitting around a table, both sides having all the time they need to ask whatever questions they want, and having a witness who has devoted his life to service of our country in Vietnam, in the State Department, in so many countries. And we've had a series of these witnesses, and we need to have more come to fill out this picture. The most important thing for us to do is to get all the facts on the table. No person is above the law, including Donald Trump. And we need to establish all the facts to decide with how best to proceed to hold him accountable. And that's what's happening. And the reason that it was so troubling to me is just how overwhelming this case is that's being built up brick by brick.
Congressman, my last question is about what you just referenced, this case being built brick by brick. It would appear that the public is traveling brick by brick with you, with public support for the impeachment and removal of Donald Trump, representing a majority of Americans. Is there any single witness who has offered a single example of the fact pattern not being what we understand it to be? And without disclosing what you heard today, we know from sources familiar with Fiona Hill's testimony, we know from sources familiar with Kurt Volker's testimony, emails that were released after that, that every single witness has offered a brick, to use your word, in the simple story you described, that Donald Trump conditioned military aid in a White House meeting on the Ukrainians committing to delivering dirt on the Bidens.
Nicolle, I don't really think where public opinion is or following polls is the way to look at this. I feel like I took an oath. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And whatever the president says, the emoluments clause is in 3 parts of the Constitution. The Constitution is a real document that we have to uphold. And it doesn't allow a president to abuse power. It doesn't allow a president to go ahead and put national security at risk for his own political ends and so forth. And so what we're trying to do is just learn as we go, have people who really have firsthand knowledge of what happened come in and tell us about it. And one thing I can commit to you is that in the end, all of this will become public. That's with appropriate, as appropriate. But we're going to do this in a way that protects the national security of the United States, and we're not going to put it at risk by having some dog and pony show. This is serious business, and we're trying to do it as best we can.
Congressman Levin, thank you for spending
Thanks,
some
Nicolle.
time with us and talking to us.
Thanks.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.